So just as people are coming in, good evening. Once again, my name is Decky Alexander, and on behalf of myself and the Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation of Greater Ann Arbor, and my partner in community, Sarah Raphael Winston, and Temple Beth Emeth, along with Bethel AME, First Baptist Church of Ann Arbor, the Muslim Community Association of Ann Arbor, we so welcome you to this Integrity First for America, which is several months in the making. Most importantly, this event really affirms our JCRC's guiding principle, but specifically to just be visible and present in the greater community during times of crisis and on vital social issues. So here we all are. Once again, this is a webinar, so please put our Q&A in the chat. We hope people are really inspired to support the critical work by Integrity First for America by the end of this evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this really important discussion with IFA. I think, and we can all agree that we are living in really frightening times. But the work of Integrity First for America gives us hope, providing a really tangible way to take action against the violent white supremacy and extremism that's poisoning this country. So 3 years ago, neo-Nazis and white supremacists descended on Charlottesville, Virginia for a weekend of violence. This violence was no accident, rather it was the result of months of planning and a preview of the extremist terror that has, of course, followed. Integrity First for America is in partnership with a world-class legal team is uniquely taking on individuals and hate groups at the center of this violent movement, holding them accountable in federal court for the violence they brought to Charlottesville in 2017. As report after report underscores the urgency of combating white supremacy and violent extremism in America, IFA's work is all the more critical. IFA, Integrity First for America, thank you for asking. So who's here in our Zoom room today? We are joined by IFA Executive Director Amy Spitelnik, sorry, apologize. Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, Washtenaw County Prosecuting Attorney Ellie Savit, and State Representative Felicia Brabeck. I'm going to introduce our Secretary of State now. In this role, Secretary Benson is focused on ensuring elections are secure and accessible, and she is the author of State Secretaries of State, Guardians of the Democratic Process, the first major book on the role of the Secretary of State in enforcing election and campaign finance laws. She is also the chair of Michigan's Task Force on Women in Sports, created by Governor Whitmer in 2019 in advance opportunities for women in Michigan as athletes and sports leaders. As a graduate of Harvard Law School, an expert on civil rights law, education law, and election law, Benson served as Dean of Wayne State University Law School in Detroit. We are so grateful she is here to join us and share some opening remarks. Secretary Benson.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you, Decky. And thank you for inviting me here to just drop by at the beginning of your great conversation to thank all of you for being a part of this really important discussion. You know, I started my career in Montgomery, Alabama, working at the Southern Poverty Law Center, investigating hate groups and hate crimes throughout the country. And it was really there where I was instilled with a deep sense of how much work we still have to do to ensure that the sacrifices of those who've come before us to make this world a better place, to ensure the right to vote was real for everyone, to integrate schools, to promote justice across the nation, were not done in vain, and that the work continues anew for each generation, as Congressman Lewis said. And what I saw doing that work at Southern Poverty was that hate was not relegated, and hate crimes was not relegated to any one group or any one area in the country, that indeed it was about power, and it was about white separatist organizations seeking to dominate and assume power over various different groups that they defined as other. And whether it was here in Michigan or in Pennsylvania or in Seattle, where I investigated a Molotov cocktail with a bomb that was thrown at a Jewish synagogue, or in Washington, D.C., or Spartanburg, South Carolina, or in Boston. It was clear to me that the work to combat violent extremism continues, and it's something we all must take seriously, even if it's something that can be swept aside. Of course, Charlottesville put it center stage, but the work that you're going to hear about tonight is how, well, many forgot or moved on from Charlottesville 3 years ago, shortly after it happened. Many did not. And you're going to hear tonight about people seeking justice for those whose lives were lost or irreparably damaged that day, and what that meant for the rest of the country and for our history. Now, of course, here in Michigan, we've seen over the past year how indeed hateful rhetoric can again lead to violent acts, whether it was people, armed protesters gathering outside my house at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night while I was trying to put my kid to bed, or people plotting egregious plots against our governor and our lawmakers to create chaos, anarchy, and overthrow, in their words, overthrow the government. The work continues to hold those individuals accountable, and the work continues to protect our society from hatred. So I just wanted to stop by tonight and say thank you to all of those who are doing this work. You're going to hear some great stories tonight. Thank you for all of you for caring, for being here, for supporting IFA and this important work that Amy and others are doing. And really, Amy's just this extraordinary leader that you'll hear from and hear more about her work. And now I want to turn it over to my good friend who in many ways helped me during my transition to becoming Secretary of State and the work that we've done. And now we're all so fortunate that he's the Washtenaw County Prosecutor, Ellie Savit. So Ellie, thank you for being here tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Secretary Benson, and it's great to be here with you all tonight. I want to place tonight's discussion in a little bit of local context, because after all, we here in Ann Arbor and in Washtenaw County, we pride ourselves in many ways on living in a progressive and welcoming community. We want to feel safe here. We want to feel safe from the ugliness of white supremacy. And look, I grew up here. I grew up here, and I was a Jewish kid. I attended synagogue here. I went to Hebrew school here. Nobody wants this more than I do. But the unfortunate truth of the matter is none of us are immune from this rising tide of white supremacy. No matter where we are, no matter what values our community as a whole holds, no matter what our community looks like. Charlottesville, Virginia is much like Ann Arbor. It is a college town. It leans progressive. Albemarle County, the county that contains Charlottesville, Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump there by over 33 points. That did not stop hate from landing on their doorstep. The horrific shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, that took place in a major city, a progressive-leaning city, in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. But the folks, the worshipers at that synagogue, were not safe from white supremacy. And as Jocelyn mentioned, we have seen white supremacy and far-right extremism rear its ugly head repeatedly here in our state. We made national news with the extremist right-wing plot to kidnap and execute our governor. We made national news before the storming of the US Capitol when armed men, some of them flashing swastikas, some of them carrying Confederate flags, stormed our own Michigan Capitol. And though we might like to think of ourselves as a bubble apart from the rest of Michigan here in Washtenaw County, we're not immune from white supremacy or hate either. Just last month, there was an incident on the University of Michigan's campus in which Black students were awakened by other students shouting racial epithets at 2 a.m. outside of their residences. My office is currently prosecuting a case in which an adult woman allegedly assaulted a 16-year-old girl of color for protesting in support of Black Lives Matter. So none of us are immune here, even in Washtenaw County, this wonderful community that we all love. And, you know, I can just say the impacts of this, the impacts of this rising national tide of white supremacy really hit all of us. I've experienced this, you know, myself in walking into synagogues and places of worship and Jewish centers where I attended carefree as a child, and now you have this pit in your stomach. You're looking over your shoulder. You're wondering, is this the next place? Is this going to be the next flashpoint where white supremacists bring violence to us? And that's why tonight's conversation is so important, because nowhere in the country is immune from this rising tide of white supremacy. And that's why those of us that oppose it need to take the fight to them. That's what IFA is doing with its landmark lawsuit against those who planned and plotted the violence and hate in Charlottesville. As a lawyer, let me tell you, I am such a huge fan of these crucial legal efforts, but I don't want to get ahead of tonight's conversation. And at this point, I want to turn it over and introduce the two folks who will lead us through this conversation today. First is State Representative Felicia Brabeck. State Representative Felicia Brabeck is serving her first term representing the 55th House District, which encompasses portions of Washtenaw County, including Ann Arbor, parts of wards 1, 2, and 5, Ann Arbor Township, Milan City, Pittsfield Township, part of it, and all of Augusta and York Townships. I hope I got your whole district right, Representative. Dr. Brabeck is also a practicing clinical psychologist with a master's degree in clinical social work, a skill that we are so grateful that she's bringing to the Michigan legislature. Over 2 decades of experience in those fields. She served on the Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners for over 9 years, and she understands deeply the importance of working with others to create a community that we all want to live in. During her time on the commission, she led the effort to create the county's first racial equity policy and has worked on everything from protecting our environment to supporting our schools. Felicia will, of course, be in conversation with Amy Spitalnik, who is the executive director of Integrity First for America, the nonpartisan civil rights nonprofit that's backing this landmark federal lawsuit that has been filed by a coalition of Charlottesville community members against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups that are responsible for the August 2017 violence. Amy joined IFA with extensive experience in government, politics, and advocacy, including as communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General, communications advisor and spokesperson for the New York City Mayor, and communications director in the New York State Senate. She has also worked on a number of federal, state, and local campaigns and advocacy organizations. Please join me in welcoming Felicia and Amy for this evening's program, which is so important now more than ever.
Thanks so much, Ellie. We really appreciate all the work that you're doing and Secretary Benson is doing. Amy, it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. We want to just acknowledge and thank everyone who has joined us for this important conversation this evening. We are grateful to our faith leaders who are here. And Amy, I'm grateful for your expertise and for the learning that we are going to be able to do this evening. As we spend about the next half hour together talking about not only this case, but what happened back in 2017, we will be able to listen. Folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Amy is going to be answering some of those. And so like I said, we'll talk for about half an hour. We'll have some questions at the end for about 10 minutes, and then we'll be able to kind of close out our time together this evening. So Amy, with that, again, thank you for being here in our community and bringing this important conversation to our community. I'd like for us to really start kind of with what happened. Bring us back to 2017. Now, explain to us what actually happened during that time in Charlottesville.
Thank you so much, Representative Brabeck and Secretary Benson and Prosecutor Savit. It's just such an incredible group of Michigan leaders that we have here tonight. And as someone who spent my prior life in local and state politics, it's particularly heartening to be in this virtual room with all of you. And thank you to everyone who's watching. I know that times are not easy right now, and the fact that you're taking an hour out of your busy lives to learn about this and to get engaged in this fight is really just incredible and really keeps us going in this effort. Before we dive into this conversation, I'm going to take a few minutes to share my screen to show a quick video that'll bring us back to Charlottesville 3.5 years ago. I do want to warn people, given the nature of what we're talking about here, there are some disturbing sounds and images in this video. So I want to make sure people are aware of that and can step away for 2 minutes if you would like. And then we will dive right into our conversation as soon as we are done with this video. Sorry. 1 second.
Terror in Charlottesville. Stark displays of racism.
Trying to promote a car has rammed into a crowd.
Victims thrown in the air.
Deadly act of domestic terror.
One woman dead, others critically wounded.
10 of the people who were injured in Charlottesville, including 3 of the people who were hit by that car and survived, have now brought a lawsuit against not only the murderer who drove his vehicle into the crowd, but also the leaders of all of the white nationalist groups that organized and promoted the Charlottesville event.
We are Integrity First for America. We are here to disrupt the extremism, to interrupt the cycle, to dismantle and bankrupt these hate groups and their leaders, to put them out of business, and most importantly, to stop the violence. Integrity First for America is leading the fight against white supremacy. Our Charlottesville lawsuit is the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement, holding white supremacists accountable for their premeditated violence. We know that it's working. They're already facing huge financial and legal consequences. But we also know what we're up against. Bankrupting Nazis isn't cheap. These groups are still recruiting, weaponizing fear, and preparing for their next attack. Now more than ever, we are reminded of our obligation to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that poison this country. Turn your outrage into action, because hate has no place here.
I feel like no matter how often I watch that video, my heart still sort of beats out of my chest every time I do, because it's so crazy to think that an American city was targeted and invaded by neo-Nazis and white supremacists in 2017 in our country. But that is exactly what happened 3.5 years ago. And before we dive into the conversation about our case and how we're fighting back, it's worth remembering some of the details of August of 2017. First, on Friday, August 11th, I think many of us remember the sort of visceral feelings we had when we saw images of that Tiki Torch March on the University of Virginia. And as I think Prosecutor Savit said earlier, Charlottesville is a community much like Ann Arbor, a college town, where the university is so central to its life. And this attack on the university was not an accident, much like nothing that happened that weekend was an accident, but rather Charlottesville and the university were targeted because of the progressive values that they embodied. So these neo-Nazis and white supremacists carrying tiki torches, which were chosen to specifically evoke the KKK and the Nazis, descended on the University of Virginia, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us," "Blood and soil," "White lives matter." They ultimately surrounded a small group of peaceful counter-protesters at the Thomas Jefferson statue, where they kicked, punched, beat them up, threw fuel and lit torches at them. One of our plaintiffs, an African-American undergrad at the university, said he thought he was going to die that night. And nearby, an interfaith gathering was taking place. Ironically, it was pulled together as a safe space for the community to come together, knowing that white supremacists were coming to town. And they ironically had to shelter in place because of how unsafe it was outside the doors. The next day, Saturday, August 12th, I think we all know how the day culminated in the car attack that killed Heather Heyer and injured many others, including many of our plaintiffs. But it's important to understand that this was not just a day of violence and not just one attack, but truly a full weekend of violence. And it started with these neo-Nazis marching, this time on downtown Charlottesville, where they surrounded the small local synagogue just a few blocks away from Emancipation Park, where the Robert E. Lee statue lived. They were there under the guise of protesting the removal of the Lee statue, but as we'll talk about tonight, that was of course not actually what they were there to do. And they surrounded the local synagogue, chanting things like Sieg Heil, talking in their online chats about, quote, torching those Jewish monsters, carrying semi-automatic weapons. And the synagogue was celebrating Shabbat. It was a Saturday morning. And so they had to evacuate congregants and Torah scrolls out the back. And the detail that gets me every single time, no matter how much I read it in our lawsuit or share it, is that the synagogue was home to a Torah scroll that was saved from Nazi Germany decades ago, a Holocaust scroll. And here in America in 2017, that Torah scroll was once again under Nazi threat. And that just gets me every single time. The violence, though, continued throughout the day. They also, in addition to terrorizing the synagogue, terrorized the Black neighborhoods in Charlottesville, driving white vans through those neighborhoods. They charged a line of interfaith clergy, including our plaintiff, Reverend Seth Wispelway, and a number of others who had been peacefully counter-protesting white supremacy in their town. And the day culminated with James Fields driving his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer, injuring many others, including a number of our plaintiffs, as you might have seen in that video. I think we all know at this point the iconic Pulitzer-winning photo of the car going through the crowd. And in that photo, you see our plaintiff, Marcus Martin, who's the African-American man splayed across the back of the car. He had pushed his then fiance, now wife Marissa, out of the way. She's also a plaintiff in our case. Natalie Romero, whose skull was fractured in the attack. You saw in that video. Thomas Baker is seen flipping over the car. So many of our plaintiffs were so grievously injured in that attack, not just physically, but of course, emotionally. And I'm sure we'll talk more about the repercussions and the impact of what happened throughout the course of this conversation. But here's what's important to understand. Nothing that happened in Charlottesville was an accident, but rather it was the result of meticulous planning for months in advance by the leaders of the white supremacist movement, who in online chats discussed everything from the mundane and banal. So, what to wear, what to bring for lunch, how do you best sew a swastika onto a flag? When Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil, I think this is precisely what she was talking about. And also the vile and the violent. They talked about how they could use quote unquote free speech instruments as weapons like flag poles, and even whether they could hit protesters with cars and claim self-defense. And so that's not an accident. That's a racist, violent conspiracy. And we are holding these extremists accountable for that conspiracy in court.
Amy, thank you for laying that awful history and reminding us of that. But again, being able to frame that for us, frame our discussion for us, and so that we all have kind of a similar starting point. Folks are asking about the action part, and what we can do. Can you talk about how the case got started and how it came about?
Absolutely. It was August of 2017 when Unite the Right happened. And it feels like several lifetimes ago, but that was the moment when Jeff Sessions was leading the Department of Justice in Washington. And it was very clear to many of us very early on, even before Charlottesville, that this was a Department of Justice that was not going to be pursuing justice and civil rights with the intensity that it needed, to put it very lightly. And so IFA was conceived of in 2017, along with many other organizations that were doing comparable work in trying to fill gaps in what our federal government clearly was not going to do in protecting civil rights and on so many other fronts. And when Charlottesville happened, I think many of us were watching in fear and in anger, and we felt a bit helpless. It's something that I think so many of us were baffled could happen in this country, even though clearly we should have seen the warning signs. But we're not helpless. We have laws and they're meant to protect us. And so that is what we at IFA, in partnership with such an incredible legal team led by Roberta Kaplan, who some of you might know as representing Edie Windsor in the landmark marriage equality case at the Supreme Court in 2013 that struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, and Karen Dunn, who's a former federal prosecutor in Virginia and former White House counsel. And the two of them and our whole legal team are just some of the most brilliant people I know, and we're so lucky to get to work with them. And our team was on the ground within days of the violence in Charlottesville because it was clear that what happened wasn't an accident, and that something needed to be done. And we had a lucky break very early on. The chats in which this violence was planned were leaked by a nonprofit journalism organization called Unicorn Riot. And they put these Discord chats out into the world in the aftermath of Unite the Right for everyone to see just how well planned this violence was and to make it sort of this open source evidence. And so with that lucky break, within days of the violence, we were able to file suit within 2 months of Charlottesville, which in a normal situation, it might take months, if not longer, to sort of subpoena and get the evidence that our plaintiffs were entitled to in order to bring a case. We had this lucky break and it allowed us to move very quickly. And the case itself is fascinating. And I think in a way is a testament to both what's at stake here and the opportunities we have. The central statute in our suit is something called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. And this, you might have heard about this statute recently because just last week, the NAACP and Representative Benny Thompson brought their own suit under the Ku Klux Klan Act against Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, the Oath Keepers, and the Proud Boys for that conspiracy to attack the Capitol and prevent Congress from finalizing the election results on January 6th, which I know we're going to dive into at some point tonight, I'm sure. But we used the statute when we filed suit 3.5 years ago. It's a fascinating statute that was created 150 years ago exactly this year by the Reconstructionist Congress to protect recently freed slaves from violent Klansmen in the South who would use violence as a means to undermine the recently freed slaves' 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights. So it's one of the few statutes in our country, one of the few civil rights statutes in our country that deals with private conduct as opposed to governmental conduct. And it provides private plaintiffs like ours a right of recourse against others who conspire to undermine their rights. And that's precisely what happened in Charlottesville. As our case details, this was a racially motivated, violent conspiracy, and the social media chats illustrate that conspiracy in ways that I think those who wrote this law 150 years ago could probably never have dreamed of. And so this isn't a speech case. This is a conspiracy case. And as the court itself has said in rejecting the defendant's motions to dismiss, and a number of other civil liberties and civil rights experts have made clear, the First Amendment does not protect violence. That's not what the First Amendment is. We, as Americans, have a right to be protected in our communities, to exercise our civil rights, whether it be the right to peacefully protest or any of the other rights we have, to practice our religion freely, free of hate and violence. And that's what the Ku Klux Klan Act was designed to protect. And so while it's been 150 years since it was first passed into law, it is sort of a sad testament to where we are at as a country right now with resurgent violent white supremacy that it has become so relevant in 2021.
I couldn't agree with you more, Amy. It's shocking, right, to know that law, the act, happened 150 years ago, and here we are. It's so relevant today. Folks have asked and are very familiar with. Secretary Benson talked about the Southern Poverty Law Center. There are many organizations doing this work. Can you talk about how this case fits in the broader network, of organizations who are in this fight?
Absolutely. We work closely with so many other fantastic organizations in this space, including the ADL, the SPLC, and others. And what we're dealing with here is really a crisis. And I think over the last few years, we've started to slowly recognize that crisis, and certainly January 6th put a fine point on it. But the experts have been ringing the alarm bells here for years. And it's not just anecdotal. I think all of us know, whether we live in Ann Arbor or Charlottesville or elsewhere, we've seen it in our own communities, that hate crimes are on the rise, that hate is on the rise, that violence is on the rise, that extremism and disinformation and conspiracies are on the rise. But we don't have to rely on that anecdotal evidence. There are hard stats that unfortunately back this up in very real ways. The FBI said hate crimes hit record levels. They were deadliest levels ever in 2019. The Department of Homeland Security said that white supremacist terror was, quote, the most persistent and lethal threat to our country last year. NGO after NGO has put out reports that show how nearly all, for example, extremist murders in the United States were committed by far-right extremists. That was an ADL report that came out just the other week. Other NGOs have put out reports illustrating the same point, that both, especially nationally, but even on the global scale, we see far-right extremists responsible for the vast majority of violent extremism. And so all of the stats point to the fact that we're dealing with a crisis here. My hope is that we are now going to start to treat this as a crisis with a new administration in Washington, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But everything that happened in Charlottesville is part of a much larger cycle of violence and extremism, and deeply connected to the cycle of violence that we've seen since. So for example, we know that the Pittsburgh shooter who killed 11 Jews praying in synagogue at Tree of Life 2.5 years ago communicated with some of the Charlottesville leaders before his attack. The Christchurch shooter in New Zealand, who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque 2 years ago, first donated to two of our defendants, Richard Spencer and Andrew Anglin of the Daily Stormer, two names that I suspect people might know, and then painted onto his gun a white power symbol that was popularized by another one of our defendants, Matthew Heimbach. So we saw how he was directly inspired by a number of our defendants. And he live streamed his horrific attack on Facebook. And he in turn seemingly inspired the Poway attack at the Chabad in California 2 years ago, the El Paso attack at a Walmart in Texas 1.5 years ago. And so we see on and on the cycle goes, in which each attack is used to inspire the next one. And these are not accidents. These are not happening in silos, but rather each attack, and especially something like Charlottesville, are meant to be flashpoints in a cycle of violence in which, using social media for the most part, these extremists are able to inspire one another to action and use the last attack to encourage the next one. And so in order to break this cycle, I think we need to go after those who are at the center of this movement. And we've seen how central our defendants have been to this cycle of violence. And so our theory of change is a simple one, that by going after the groups and the leaders that are at the center of this movement, we can bankrupt them, we can dismantle them, we can set a precedent that creates a deterrent for others who are considering being a part of this violence. And we can create a model for accountability so that those responsible for this sort of violent hate are fully held accountable in the way that they should be.
And Amy, you were just talking about some of the potential implications. What are you actually seeing in terms of those defendants and the impact that the case and kind of the network working together to hold them accountable is having on them?
So what's been heartening is that even before we go to trial, and we are going to trial this October, we were supposed to go to trial last October and then COVID hit. And so it was pushed until next October. This will be a large jury trial in Charlottesville with 24 plaintiffs, 24 defendants, 9 plaintiffs, so a large legal team, witnesses, experts, a whole host of people who will need to be part of this. And so we thought having that jury trial was too important to switch it to a virtual bench trial, a trial just with a judge. And so we are going to trial this October in Charlottesville. Our fingers are crossed after so many delays thanks to the pandemic and thanks to the defendant's own difficulty in turning over evidence. But because the defendants have tried every trick in the book to avoid accountability here, which shouldn't come as a surprise for anyone, neo-Nazis are not the biggest fans of the rule of law. They have also been held accountable for that flagrant violation of court orders. And so every time they have refused to comply with court orders or turn over their phones, computers, social media, and email accounts as the court has instructed, we filed what's called motions for sanctions and taken other steps to hold them accountable to their obligations. And so as a result of those sanctions, we've won, for example, tens of thousands of dollars in penalties against a number of defendants. 2 have had bench warrants issued for their arrest, including one that sat in jail last January for a period of time. And in a civil case like ours, I think that is fairly extraordinary to have defendants sit in jail. Some defendants have talked explicitly about the financial and operational impact this has had on them. Most notably, and I think he's perhaps the best spokesperson for our case in ways that I can't even be, Richard Spencer called our case, quote, financially crippling, and said he can't raise money because he's been deplatformed from a number of social media sites. And that, I think, serves as far greater validation of the importance of accountability than anything I can tell you. And similarly, we've had defendants like League of the South, which is a neo-Confederate hate group, say they can't open a new building because of our case, on and on. And just today, actually, another one of our defendants, Chris Cantwell, was sentenced to 41 months in prison for threats he made against a fellow white nationalist. But in that case, we, of course, specifically highlighted the threats he's made against our own team and our own lead counsel. And he, too, has complained about the impact of our case on his ability to operate. Of course, it will be much harder in prison, where he will be for the next 41 months. But in general, it's been very heartening to see the impact of this case. It proves that accountability matters. And if a small nonprofit like us can financially cripple Richard Spencer, imagine what could be done when, for example, the Department of Justice uses the tools it already has to hold extremists accountable. So it's so important that we see this not just as an opportunity to hold accountable the defendants in our suit, which is key, but also as validation that this strategy works, that accountability matters, and that when it exists and when we are aggressive in pursuing it, there are very real consequences.
Amy, one of the questions that we've had, and I think it's an interesting one to consider, although different years, different circumstances, is there any consideration, or is it even proper from a legal standpoint to join the case, the Charlottesville case, and the case in terms of the Capitol insurrection?
Well, it's a fantastic question. And we wrote an op-ed in the days after the Capitol attack that detail all the alarming parallels between what happened in Charlottesville and what happened at the Capitol. So I think it's worth spending a few minutes talking about those, and also noting that one of the most concerning elements of what happened at the Capitol is that, unlike in places like Charlottesville, so many of the people who participated were not necessarily members of traditional white supremacist or neo-Nazi groups. And the ADL and the SPLC have talked about this in their research over the last month or so. Rather, these are people who have, in many cases, perhaps never participated in a white supremacist or neo-Nazi event or other sort of violent or far-right extremist event. And that speaks to the mainstreaming of extremism that has happened in this country over the last few years. And I know that that's probably also true of some of the heinous violence we've seen in Michigan over the last year, including the lockdown protests and the armed extremism we saw there. And of course, the threats against the governor and the Secretary of State, among others. And so we're seeing how this mainstreaming of extremism has really manifested in disturbing ways over the last few years. And that rather than being, the traditional neo-Nazi leaders that we might know of, like Andrew England and Richard Spencer and our defendants, this is now percolated into the more traditional right. And of course, that's not a surprise when you have members of Congress both actively encouraging what happened at the Capitol and espousing some of the very same ideologies that have fueled these attacks, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was trafficked in the very sort of white supremacist conspiracies that motivated Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso, and so on. And so it's not a surprise, but it should still horrify all of us. That being said, the ways in which Charlottesville really previewed the cycle of violence that followed, and specifically previewed the tools and the tactics we saw at the Capitol on January 6th, are just stunning. We saw over and over again how these extremists use social media, in so many cases out in the open for the world to see, which makes the failure to catch this early all the more disturbing. Using social media to recruit, to inspire, and to plan violence, as we saw at the Capitol. We saw these extremists, much like in Charlottesville, show up prepared for violence, show up with tools and weapons, whether it be knives or other traditional weapons, or the willingness to use those quote unquote free speech instruments as weapons, including, for example, the officer who was beaten with a flagpole at the Capitol. And they also, of course, showed up in tactical gear. They were ready for a violent fight, and that was clear in how they came prepared. Of course, at the core of both attacks is a vile far-right extremism. In Charlottesville, it might have been a more obvious traditional white supremacy, talking about the replacement theory, this idea that Jews will not replace the white race by supporting the Black community, the Latinx community, the immigrant and refugee community. sure we'll dive into that perhaps if we have time. At the Capitol, though, while the language might have been a little different, while the messaging might have been a little different, it was fundamentally rooted in the same idea of the country being stolen from white people. And of course, there were the explicit white supremacist items there, the noose, the Confederate flag, the Camp Auschwitz shirt, which should, again, horrify all of us. But for me, in some ways, equally concerning, if not more so, was the implicit white supremacy, this idea that they had to stop the steal of the country from white people, which is what was at the core of what we saw at the Capitol. And there's so many other ways in which these attacks have paralleled each other, including the immediate finger pointing at Antifa. There's no evidence Antifa was involved in the violence in either place. And even just today, having Republican members of Congress asking a panel at a subcommittee hearing on domestic terror what they're going to do about Antifa a couple weeks after an insurrection at the Capitol led by far-right extremists. And so this sort of both sides false equivalency is so dangerous and something that we've seen in both cases. And I could go on and on about the parallels, but I'll stop there. But suffice it to say that we knew what this playbook was. We saw it in Charlottesville. And so none of us should have been surprised when the Capitol happened. We could be horrified, we could be shocked, but we can't be surprised that something like this happened because it was the inevitable culmination of years of bigotry, of disinformation, of conspiracy, and outright incitement to violence.
And unfortunately, practice.
Exactly.
Yeah, practice. I know that we talked about having kind of a separate Q&A time, and I'm just kind of weaving them throughout our conversation here, Amy. And another question that we were asked is, there are cultural and social factors that really aid in the rooting, of the white supremacy, thoughts and belief system. What are your ideas about how to really handle that, to tackle it, to dismantle it?
Yeah. Well, I think first, to understand it, I think it's worth understanding it in order to dismantle it, right? And so I mentioned earlier replacement theory, which is the vile conspiracy theory at the heart of so many of these extremist attacks that we've seen over the last few years. And it's this idea that the Jews are the puppet masters who are orchestrating the replacement of the white race. They are doing this by supporting the Black community. For example, how America had its first Black president, there was no way unless it was the Jews. That is what these people believe. The same way that they believe Jews are orchestrating swarms of immigrants and refugees and others coming in to, again, effectively commit white genocide, which is what they believe. This is what they mean when they say Jews will not replace us. It's why, for example, the Pittsburgh shooter chose that congregation, because it worked with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society to support immigrants and refugees. And so we see it that far-right conspiracy manifests in many obvious and violent ways, including in Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and Poway and El Paso and Christchurch. This isn't just a domestic issue, it's a global issue. But what's as concerning is the ways in which it manifests in more subtle mainstream ways. And it's so important to call that out and understand it because, again, it could be your neighbor who is falling prey to this sort of extremism because of the ways in which this extremism has been mainstreamed and espoused by our elected officials in certain cases. So when you hear, for example, about George Soros supporting the Black Lives Matter protests or funding a caravan of people coming up from Central America, that is really replacement theory in action, this idea of Jews as puppet masters replacing the white race. And so understanding how this manifests is so important to breaking the cycle. We think accountability matters. We think our case is a crucial way to do so, or to have that accountability, but it's not a silver bullet. There's so much more that needs to happen. There needs to be action on the part of state, local, and federal governments. There needs to be action by the private sector and social media companies in particular. And there needs to be action in terms of education. And there are so many phenomenal organizations doing work in that space, from Facing History to the ADL to SPLC and many others who have recognized that severe gap and are trying to begin to address it as well. The Western States Center as well is another fantastic organization that comes to mind. And so having that comprehensive approach is the only way we are going to start to get not just at the accountability angle. It's important when people commit this racist violence, we hold them accountable, but the goal shouldn't be just accountability. It should also be rooting it out on the front end. And we do that through education. We do that through de-radicalization programs. We do that through investing in our federal government and state and local governments to ensure that they are effectively identifying, prosecuting hate crimes, that so many of the important steps that some folks talked about earlier at the beginning of this call are exactly the sort of things we need our local and state officials doing to make sure that we are catching this on the front end. And similarly, when I was in the New York AG's office in 2016, we saw this horrific rise in hate crimes in the aftermath of the election. I remember sort of vividly reading the news that a swastika was found at my local playground in my Brooklyn neighborhood, which was crazy to me. That something like that could happen in Brooklyn, but it is a reality of the world we live in now. And so we put out this guidance that made clear to local officials and police departments their obligations to prosecute hate crimes and make sure that they were effectively taking on those responsible for these sorts of hate crimes. And there's so much that we have the power to do, not just on the national level, not just if you can bring a lawsuit like ours, but on the local levels, on the state level, from the education and de-radicalization work to the accountability work. And so it's going to take that comprehensive approach to break the cycle and effectively address this crisis of extremism.
Yeah, you just talked, Amy, about kind of the different levels of government and things that we can do. And I know here on on the state level, one of my colleagues, Representative Sarah Anthony, really has pushed some of this, particularly in terms of domestic terrorism, and really calling it out, right? Like naming it, calling it out, and my guess is that right now for us, it won't go anywhere because we're a Republican-led legislature, but we have to make those statements. Those are so important to do. And you've alluded to this, but now having a different administration and having the Biden administration, what do you think we can anticipate? What are you thinking might change now because of the change in administration? What can we look to from them?
So, for me, and I'm sure for many of you watching inauguration and watching the comments that came out of the administration in the subsequent days was sort of a revelation. And I say this not as a partisan comment, but just for the first time in 4 years, having someone effectively call out white supremacy and commit to dealing with it in a way that the prior administration, of course, not only disinvested from those efforts, but actively threw fuel on the fire. And so we know under the Trump administration, Department of Justice civil rights investigations were down 2/3. We know that, for example, funding was cut for programs like the Department of Homeland Security's domestic terror intelligence programs. And then, of course, that doesn't include the fact that the federal government and the president himself actively threw fuel on the fire by inspiring and embracing these extremists and calling them fine people, which gave them a level of emboldenedness that nothing else could have done. It was a stamp of approval from the highest levels of our government. And so there's so much that can be done right now by this new administration, not even requiring new tools, but simply by using all of the tools the federal government already has. And on day 3 of the Biden administration, it was so heartening to see the press secretary, Jen Psaki, announce some initial steps that the administration is going to be taking to evaluate this threat, to understand the threat in a more robust and comprehensive way, to identify resources, to bolster those resources. And there are a number of other initial steps that can be taken that don't even necessarily require new statutes and new huge programs, but rather using the tools we have. For example, can I look at the question of white supremacy in the military, which certainly the last few months has put a fine point on in terms of the urgency. I think many have seen the reports on how a number of those involved in the insurrection at the Capitol were veterans and members of the military. And so there's a bill called the Domestic Terror Prevention Act that would, among many things, create the ability to officially and formally evaluate that threat, to close gaps between reporting on the local, state, and federal levels. There's other bills like the No Hate Act that would improve the hate crime reporting that we have on a national level, because it's such a sort of spotty reporting system right now, and that we really have no good sense of just how bad hate crimes are. We know that they're bad. We know that according to the FBI, they were the deadliest level ever in 2019, but that's without some of the data that we should have. So having a consistent level of reporting there. And so these are all very basic steps that this administration has indicated it is already going to take in a number of cases, and that can be done without totally overhauling the tools that the federal government has, because there's so much that simply not only wasn't done, but was actively undermined for the last 4 years. And so we think it's so crucial that one, it appears the administration is hitting the ground running in that regard. Two, of course, there's the Department of Justice itself and the prosecutions that have come out of the Capitol. And we're starting to see not just individual cases, but some smaller conspiracy cases, and hope that our case can continue to serve as a model for the sort of broader based conspiracy case we think should happen here. And three, also, there's value in having leaders who name and call out this threat. And having a president who has made this explicit and central to his messaging sends a clear signal that this is not who we are supposed to be. It is who we are right now. This is like all these people who said this isn't who we are when January 6th happened. This is who we are right now, but it's not who we're supposed to be. And having a president who recognizes that, who calls this out, and who makes it central has value that is so important that I think we've lost sight of perhaps over the last 4 years, because we had a president who, like I said, not only actively disinvested from this work, but actively threw fuel on the fire. And so while we will, of course, be holding this administration's feet to the fire in terms of what we hope to see, the initial steps have been incredibly encouraging and really just a revelation compared to the last 4 years.
I want to encourage folks to continue to ask questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them since we're kind of weaving them, throughout this conversation that we're having with Amy tonight, but please keep asking them. Amy, one of the things that you've touched on is, the DOJ, and we've had a couple of questions about, what they're doing or not doing, and might that change now? And, anything that you're hearing about that, and also what's in the DOJ's purview? Yeah. How can they hold folks accountable?
Well, DOJ was created specifically to protect people's civil rights. And there is also a civil rights division at DOJ that is tasked with, again, protecting people's civil rights. And Merrick Garland, in his confirmation hearing earlier this week, I thought spoke so poignantly about both the history of the department and how he, as a Jew and as American, was sort of called to action to serve his country in this role because of the prosecution his own family faced as Jews in Europe decades ago. And that he feels the need to sort of pay his country back by serving in this role, by protecting the rights of his fellow Americans. And I think that is, for me, that was just really powerful. And similarly, a number of the nominees for other positions, including Vanita Gupta, who was nominated to be the third in command at DOJ, and Kristen Clark, who's actually a former colleague of mine from the New York AG's office and the former president of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, was nominated to lead the Civil Rights Division. And I think these two women and the others who have been nominated to senior roles at DOJ, including Garland, have made this issue central both to their careers beforehand. Garland was a prosecutor in the Oklahoma City case, and Vanita and Kristen have made white supremacy and violent extremism central to their work for years. And that should be a very good signal for all of us who are looking at DOJ to lead on this front, but also in the words that they have said since being nominated. And so DOJ has so many tools at its disposal. Of course, we're already seeing, again, both individual cases against the insurrectionists and some of these initial conspiracy cases that go after, for example, the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers and sort of these pockets of extremists. We think that DOJ could bring a broader based conspiracy case that takes on the full conspiracy of what happened in some way. I don't want to assume what they might do or what the final evidence will point to, but there has been reports, for example, of a potential RICO case, which is this conspiracy statute typically used against gang members or mafia members. And so there's so much that DOJ can do within the tools it has. We have seen this extremism before. It's not new. It's precisely what, for example, the Ku Klux Klan Act was created to address 150 years ago, the statute we're using in our suit. So this is not new. It's manifesting in different ways, in modern ways, the role of social media, with the fact that we had a president that so actively encouraged it, and the fact that we have leaders in Congress that are still actively defending and encouraging some of these people. And it's manifesting in perhaps different ways, but it is still the same sort of violent white supremacy that has poisoned this country for so long, and that we have a unique opportunity now to take on in aggressive and comprehensive ways, because January 6th served as such a wake-up call, not just for many of us, but frankly for the very people who were attacked on January 6th, who are going to be responsible for making sure this doesn't fall off the radar screen in the coming months and years.
Amy, I want to ask two more questions, and I know that we're also coming to time. So, but someone had a great question that I think is worth sharing with everyone, and that's, is there a worry that the efforts by IFA, Southern Poverty Law Center, that could somehow be misused to come down on folks who are legitimately protesting and peacefully protesting? Is there concern about that?
So we are not concerned about these civil cases like ours, or about the cases that are being sort of brought as it is. The concern mentioned in that question is one that a number of civil rights groups have raised around, for example, the potential of a new domestic terror statute on the federal level. And it is a very real concern that a statute like that could, for example, allow a different federal administration to go after groups like Black Lives Matter in an irresponsible and inappropriate way. And so I think it's very important that as the federal government looks at next steps here, if it looks to add tools to the toolbox, it needs to do so in a way that can't be abused, that can't undermine the rights of groups that are just legitimately exercising their First Amendment rights to protest. And what's so important to understand as well about our case is that what happened is that our plaintiffs' First Amendment rights were undermined. That's what our case is ultimately about. Our plaintiffs' rights, including their First Amendment right to peacefully counter-protest white supremacists coming to town, were undermined by violent extremists who targeted them with that violence as a means to undermine those rights. And so while we feel confident about our case, and for example, I should say a number of former presidents of the ACLU have written in support of our case and talked about how it is an effective way to take on these extremists while protecting the First Amendment. This is a broader question that we're going to need to seriously consider as the federal government's response evolves over the coming months and years and new tools are explored.
Thank you for that, Amy. I know as we kind of wrap up our time, folks may be wondering, what can we do to help? How can we help? How can we support either IFA or the case? What's the next action?
There is so much that we can do. And I mentioned earlier what our local and state and federal officials can do, but we are not powerless. I think in this moment, it's so easy to feel helpless and hopeless and scared and frustrated. I know I do at times. And I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And for me, the last few years have put a very fine point on that history. I think it's impossible to live through what we're living through as a country and not think about the darkest times in our history. But there's a big difference between my grandparents' generation in Europe and our country right now, which is that we live in a country that is based on the rule of law, that has a justice system. And while we've had to fight like crazy to protect that rule of law and protect our justice system, we can use it to fight back against these violent extremists when they undermine our rights. And that's exactly what we're doing at IFA. And so if you're so inspired to be a part of this effort, there's so much that you can do. Please go to our website, which is in the chat right now, and it will be emailed to you after this event, integrityfirstforamerica.org. If you are inspired to donate, please know that one, we are a 501c3. Every dollar is tax deductible that you donate. And two, it directly funds critical security and evidence collection efforts in our case. It directly funds this lawsuit. So the legal work itself is being donated by extraordinary, brave, and brilliant attorneys who have put millions upon millions of dollars into representing our plaintiffs. But we are threatened quite often by these neo-Nazis. This is the part of the night where I always look to see if my mother's on, because this is the part of my job she's not particularly thrilled about. The threats are real. And they use them to try to avoid accountability. They use threats and harassment to scare us from holding them accountable. We're not going to let them do that, but we are going to raise money to make sure that our team is safe, not both now ahead of trial, and when we actually go to trial in Charlottesville for weeks at a time this coming fall. And so know that every dollar you donate directly supports those security efforts, the efforts to recover evidence from defendants' phones and computers, including when their phones magically fall in the toilet, as they sometimes have in our case. And even, no matter what you can give, it directly supports this case and helps. And even if you can't give, spread the word on social media with your network. So we're going to send the recording of this event out afterwards, share it with your friends and family, let them know that there's this concrete, tangible way to take action in this moment. And more broadly, don't let this issue fall off the radar screen. Hold your officials to account for keeping this issue front and center. Hold the private sector and social media companies to account, knowing that they have an obligation to address rampant extremism on their platforms. And make sure that when the news cycle moves on from January 6th, we are still keeping this issue front and center.
Amy, we're so grateful to you for coming to our community here. Like you said, when we all first got to meet, I wish it was in person. I wish we were able to have this conversation in person, but I'm so grateful that we have the technology to have such an important conversation and to have it with our community members and to hear about not only your experience, but your expertise and being able to do what we all need to do, which is hold folks accountable for this vile behavior. So we're grateful to you for sharing this time with us. We also want to turn this back over. We have faith leaders who are here with us tonight. And so want to turn this back over to Decky and Sarah to introduce all of our amazing faith leaders who are with us this evening.
Felicia, thank you so much. It was an honor to have you in this space and facilitate this conversation, just not given who you are as a person, but also your understanding of our local community. And Amy, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your story in our community. We're so grateful that we don't feel as voiceless with you actually leading this particular sort of way in charge to sort of defend against hate. And I also want to thank Secretary Benson and County Prosecutor Ellie Savit for giving voice to both the local and the national elements, the state, the local, and the national aspects of what I call organized hate. Just want to say something before I hand it over to my friend Sarah, who's going to introduce our faith leaders. That to bankrupt hate, organized hate, and white supremacy is challenging. And so if you can, as Amy said, support Integrity First for America in any way, you can go to their website, you can spread the word. I see somebody said spread it on Facebook. You can absolutely do that. You're going to get a recording of this particular event. If your questions weren't answered, they're going to answer it. So please, if you feel you can donate any or support this organization to dismantle and to bankrupt hate and to make it accountable, the white supremacy movement in our country, it's going to need some resources. So thank you so much for spending this time with us, and thank you to our community for coming together to have this really thoughtful, nuanced conversation about the state of our state. That said, I'm going to pass it over to Sarah, and she will take us out from here. Okay, Sarah.
Hi, good evening. My name is Sarah Rachel Whinston. For me, tonight is about hope. IFA is bringing hope to me, like Amy, a proud Jew, granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, and fierce advocate for equity and justice. And when I think back to who taught me about hope, she did. She taught me about hope, and she taught me about faith, which is why I'm so grateful to the 4 clergy members who are going to close out our program with blessings of hope, blessings of community, and blessings of peace. I'd like to introduce you to Sheikh Abdullah Al-Mahmudi, Reverend Stacey Simpson Duke, Pastor Rashad Evans, and Rabbi Josh Whinston. Thank you again for being here.
Hello, good evening. From the bottom of my heart, I'd like to thank IFA and all the respected panelists who are with us tonight for working together to abrogate white supremacy, which in essence is each one of our responsibility as humans, regardless of our backgrounds, of our faith, of our race. Just one statement of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which comes to mind, which is really relevant to us tonight. He said that whoever amongst you sees an evil, he must change it physically with his hand. And if he is unable to do so, then with his tongue. And if that is unable, then consider it a vice in his heart. And that's the weakest form of an individual's faith. So I pray that these efforts are successful, and we see the fruits of these efforts, where we see an equal and just society, which is free from all forms of extremism here in America. Thank you.
I'm so honored and humbled to be a part of this event tonight and so grateful. And I want to acknowledge across this virtual space that each of us is situated in a physical space that was historically the home of Indigenous peoples who suffered the brutality of the same colonizing violence of white supremacy we've been reflecting on here tonight. I'm honored to offer this blessing from the traditional lands of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Wyandot peoples. May we remember and honor all who have endured the cruelty and injustice of white supremacy. May we be honest about the fact that the history of violence in our nation is long and the roots of white supremacy are deep. And as we heard from Amy a moment ago, this is who we are, but we can be better, and together we can be braver. May the spirit among us tonight make us brave. May we be truth tellers, justice seekers, peacemakers, hope bearers. May we be clear in our conviction and united in our message that hate has no place in our community or in our country. May the morally and spiritually bankrupt forces of white nationalism be also bankrupted of their money, their means, their access, and their power. May they be held accountable. May their cause be dismantled. May their cycles of hate and fear and violence be overcome and undone by us, by we the people. Blessings be upon the just and righteous work of IFA and upon the hard and holy work of their legal team. May God give them everything they need as they fight the power of hate with the hard work of justice. May God also bless the plaintiffs and work healing in their lives and in the community of Charlottesville and in the wounded heart of our nation. And may we the people rise up to ensure that what happened there will never happen again. May justice flow down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream in us, through us, and around us in the name of all that is true, all that is just, and all that is good. Amen.
My name is Mashod Evans, and it's my privilege and honor to sit with these other clergy individuals. And I find and count myself blessed in this space at this time. As we consider the impact of white supremacy and white separatist groups in our nation's history, I think it's important to also recognize and realize that white supremacy did not begin in Charlottesville, nor did it end on Capitol Hill on January the 6th. However, it is a part of a longer legacy of the evil of racism, sexism, separatism, classism that is part of our nation's history. And in order to address that, we need to do so hand in hand and heart, and move forward in a way that respects the dignity of all people. I'm proud and privileged to serve a congregation which happens to be one of the older African-American congregations in Washtenaw County, founded by men and women, many of whom were the children of those who were enslaved. And as part of that tradition, and also understanding that it's African-American History Month, I'd like to leave with the words shared by James Weldon Johnson, who, with his brother Rosman Johnson, wrote a poem that would become a hymn that would become an anthem, and is familiar to many as the African-American anthem. And the second stanza reads and sings, "Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in days when hope unborn had died, but yet with a steady beat, had not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers and mothers sighed." The events of Charlottesville and Capitol Hill and all of the other events in our nation's history, it may have felt as if hope had died in those moments. However, the work of the IFA, the work of all of those who are around us and the allies and the advocates of who really believe in justice and freedom, it's with a steady beat that our feet keep on moving, placing one foot in front of the other until we come to that place, that promised land for which our parents and foreparents and ancestors have sighed. So I speak a word of hope, a word of blessing, all of those who stay and stand in the struggle. And yes, the road will be stony. And yes, there will be pain, but we're never promised that the road will be easy or that there will be no sacrifice. And while it is a hard and stony road, it leads toward a place of promise, hope, and justice.
An enormous thank you to the IFA. Amy, I hope you know, and the rest of the folks that work at IFA know that even as we support you in ways that we were able, that we also support you with our spirit and hope and pray for your continued security as you fight this courageous battle. A huge thank you as well to all of those who helped organize this evening. Such a tremendous experience for us in Ann Arbor to be together to hear this important story. And a big thank you to my clergy friends and partners here as well. White supremacy and white nationalism are at the heart of hatred in America. They have defined our country for far too long. Oh God, be our guide through this shadow of death. Help us see the way forward. Yes, holding these white militants accountable for their actions, but also in healing our country. And yes, we are tired, but it is still a healing that depends on us, on communities of color, on communities of religious minorities, on communities that have felt the pain and suffering of original American sin, on communities who are othered in America, and yes, on white Christian communities joining in the struggle. Oh God, be our guide in the months and years to come as we continue to battle this sin and unite in common purpose. Imbue us with strength and courage to eradicate this plague of hatred from our land. Let us know justice as mighty waters, hear the still small voice of your calling, and see righteousness established in our land, so that our going out and our coming in may finally be ways of peace.
Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. It is such an honor to be with the four of you and hear those incredible words. And as I was thinking, when you think about neo-Nazis all day, hearing words of wisdom and inspiration like the four of you just provided is so heartening. And so we are so grateful to all of you and especially to everyone, the hundreds of people who took the time out of their busy lives to be with us here tonight. We will be sending out information tomorrow for how you can get involved. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. We are so grateful to all of you, to everyone who was a part of this program. And again, those of you who took time out of your lives to listen tonight. Thank you so much and have a great evening.